Claim your free AirPods today by clicking the first link in the description down below.
r/AskReddit by Real-Time Reddit. High school teachers of Reddit, what have you overheard from your students that makes you think differently of them? One 10th grader to another. Dude. We were so drunk last night. I probably had 60 beers. Sheesh. Rookie numbers, am I right, bro? Not high school. But my wife taught English at a university. Her department required the students to write journals for their composition classes. And her students were very open in their journal entries. The most memorable one to me was a student taking about how he went to jail for arson when he burnt down the local paper company. She had lots of people talking about relationship drama, BFGF cheating on them, drug habits, etc. It was a wild ride. As an English teacher, I can say that many students are shockingly open in their papers. When I worked at a college, there were a number of things I read about my students' upbringing that I could have happily gone my whole life without knowing. But I'm glad they were able to share it. I'm a college prof, not high school. And I mentioned this story in another post. But I had a student who was a retired professor. So my first impression was, wow, maybe I'll have some interesting conversations with this student. Nope. Not at all. I'd overhear him mumbling and rolling his eyes at me if he didn't like something I said. He'd come to my office hours early and then complain to the administration that I wasn't professional. Once during office hours, he tried to test me by bringing in a stone tool replica and try to get me to identify it, then was surprised that I knew what it was. In office hours, he once said that he couldn't believe I'll let students ask questions in class because he would never allow that. He asked me in the middle of class if I had ever been sexually assaulted and to describe it. Students were working on a project for the class, and he announced to the class that other students could work with him on the project and gain valuable experience from him. He then got upset that no one wanted to be in his group and learn from him. No, Stuart. They do not. Sounds like a guy pretending to be an undercover professor in order to degrade your teaching and make himself feel superior. Stuart belongs in r/I am embarrassment. Not a teacher. Did work experience at a primary school last year though. There was a little girl who was loud and rude and was really mean to the other kids, and I instantly figured she was a naughty, spoiled kid. Then later in the week she comes in with bruises on her arms and face. She would only talk to me, IDKY, but she said that it was her dad that did it. Broke my heart. Especially when she said she was men's because she thought she should be like her daddy. My work experience ended before the issue was fully resolved with the parents etc, but I'm pretty sure it ended happily. Did you not try to contact her or maybe ask some other teacher to let you know what had happened? I heard one of my students, 15 years old, ask her BFF if her tits looked good in the top she was wearing because her sister's boyfriend was going over and she wanted to impress him. This was a straight A student who had her face stuck in a book all day. I had to do a double take to make sure it was her. The quietest ones are always the freakiest. I was a teacher a couple of years back in a super impoverished area. Two stories stand out. Both involved kids that I thought were little shits by their behavior in class. One kid would always talk during class and was clearly a jock, popular kid. He paid more attention to soccer than his coursework and never handed in an assignment on time. I hated him with a passion for constantly disrupting my class, even though he objectively seemed like a nice guy. One day I was at a diner, and I saw him walk in with a little kid. I said hi and we exchanged pleasantries, and it turns out this kid was his son. He was 17 years old and he had a toddler to take care of, and he seemed like a really good dad despite it all. I went a lot easier on him in class after that. Another kid, also a really bratty little shit during class, came to class one day, and as I went around checking they'd done their homework, he tells me he hasn't done the homework. I grunt and internally hate him, as always. But as he took out his notebook I saw one of his doodles. It was beautiful. This kid had an incredible artistic talent and I was so proud of him. I really wish teachers would actually consider stuff like this before just judging them instantly and singling them out. I was mistreated by several of my teachers in kindergarten and elementary because of their irrational hatred which lead to trauma. The school year just started and my girlfriend is a middle school teacher. She always starts the year very strictly, establishes order, then eases back. It creates a much better class structure. Well, before school the other day she had a very engaging one-on-one conversation with one of her new students about something. That student went back to her group of friends after and said, "I can't believe it. Ems. So and so is actually really nice." By her own admission she is a bit of a beach at the beginning of the year, but it's for the greater good later on. That sounds like a really smart teaching strategy. During my student teaching, I taught a high school senior English class. Kids were cool and several really struggled, but challenged them as much as possible. One girl was sweet but never quite put in the effort. At the beginning she was like, "I just want to be a hairdresser/cosmetologist," stated during get to know you activity. One of the last papers I had them write was a personal essay. She wrote, literally, one of the best essays I had ever read. To the point where my suggested edits actually made it worse. I told her this and said she should try to read it at graduation. She burst into tears and was like, "That's the first move thing a teacher has ever said about my writing." At the end when we were doing class goodbyes and saying where we're going, she had added maybe pursuing being a kindergarten teacher. She didn't. But the fact that she began to consider other ideas was awesome. She burst into tears and was like, "That's the first move thing a teacher has ever said about my writing." Unfortunately, these spelling errors will knock you down a couple points on this paper. OP. I taught a very high functioning SPED classroom with kids 8-18. I, 28 at the time, was the lead teacher and the rest of the assistants and one-on-ones were older ladies. Mostly retired teachers who wanted to work PT in a classroom a few hours a week. We did a lot of group rotations because different ages and abilities. And there was this 11-year-old with a ton of older sisters at home who displayed a lot of male chauvinism for his age. One day he came over with his workbook so he could do his rotation and he said, "Ready to work, sweetie?" and put his hand on my thigh. Was that how his sisters treated him at home? Though? Like he thought that was totally normal? Because it's so hard to imagine a guy with all sisters growing up extra macho. I'm also laughing my ass off at this imagery. Not a teacher, but was a tutor at a math center. I would work with up to 4 students at once ranging from K-12. A new kid comes on one day, probably like 8th grade. And before I can even finish introducing myself, he asks, "How many solo Fortnite wins do you have?" I was very ready for this kid to be a complete ass. But I later had him one-on-one and it turned out he was actually very smart and thoughtful. He just put on a facade when his friends were around. Turned out to be one of the better students I ever worked with at that job. "How many solo Fortnite wins do you have?" But I later had him one-on-one. I saw this going somewhere totally different. I used to teach Sunday school. I did not hear the entire convo. But one of the girls said something like, "Yeah, she is so annoying. She'll suck a guy's dong for anything." During teaching practice, I was at a high school, Eastern Europe. Part of my assessment was interviewing a student. And my topic was independence and autonomy in high school students, whether or not to encourage it. Pros, cons, expectations, etc. I had asked the teacher for the best student, particularly one that showed the most autonomy and independence in his/her own learning. One of my questions was whether or not the school sufficiently encouraged independent growth and autonomy, yes, and whether this student would like more of it. This was supposed to be a leading question to some of my other questions about strategies and whether or not the school was a hindrance. The student said no without hesitation. My further inquiries confirmed that the student did not misunderstand the question. It is so bog standard to hold the opinion as a high schooler here that you wish to control your own education, so to speak. I had considered it a healthy symptom of growth, as a stepping stone to developing personal strategies in learning and life. But here was the best student, quite contrarily thinking that the school does a good job and that students, when given more freedom, will only waste their time on stupid shit. I was, putting it mildly, flabbergasted at how reflected, smart and aware this student was. to the point that such a typically personal or political affair was devoid of emotion. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, there's this Yautabi link. I am not a teacher, but we taught my English teacher different words and their meaning like Karen, Chad, etc. She definitely thinks different of us now. Obligatory not me. In high school I could be a bit obnoxious and flippant about schoolwork. I hated to do any work outside of class, but I was generally smart. Mostly lazy. I cared more about the sport I played than about school. I was also insecure and very right and religious, leaning to cover up the fact I was gay. I always felt like my English teacher wasn't a fan of me, but she was never mean. One day after school my best friend and I were talking in her room. I was telling my best friend that I was really scared of coming out because my stepdad always said really homophobic things. After that my teacher was much more friendly and we eventually became close. I was even her TA my senior year of high school. Having an adult open-minded confidant helped me feel more comfortable with myself and helped me a lot during those years. Quiet. Nice. Well-liked girl in high school. I want to be just like Sarah Huckabee Sanders when I grow up. Big oof. Do any of y'all losers have any questions that don't refer to the Moolah witch hunt? I had a student once who I like very much and still do, by the way. I honestly thought he was just kind of a goof-off kid. He always got his stuff done and he was floating along. It was clear he was going to get through high school, but he was going to float along and just be happy. I did not think he was a very serious-minded person. I had this student once who I like very much and still do, by the way. I honestly thought he was just kind of a goof-off kid. He always got his stuff done and he was floating along. It was clear he was going to get through high school, but he was going to float along and just be happy. I did not think he was a very serious-minded person. Close to graduation time, we were talking one-on-one about his career goals. He was in the process of selecting colleges and majors. He had everything lined up. That is to say, he had prioritized his choices of school and major. He had told me that he was selecting a business major because it would prove to be more lucrative than a music major. He went on to say that he wanted to make as much money and save it up before he made any decisions about starting a family. If you could have seen this kid, you would have never realized that he had those thoughts running around in his head. It taught me to ask more questions about my individual students. The way you say once instead of once annoys me a bit. Edit. Got major deja vu reading that second paragraph though. Lol. I teach in a private school. That is expensive. Kids wear brand name stuff and have all the latest in terms of fashion and tech. I used to think a lot of them were very spoilt and entitled. And some of them are. But I remember hearing a kid, who usually spends more money than most, ask his friend if he'd be hated in university for having so much wealth. He wound up asking me a little later and I explained to him to just be himself and maybe not be so flashy with his spending or what he's wearing if he was that concerned. In this community it was fine, but university is a horse a different color. Kinda reminded me that these kids, wealthy as they are, still want to fit in and be liked. Just like every other teen. This question has potential. I'm upvoting it and waiting to read the replies later. You do realize that this thread will be full of not a teacher but answers, right? I work with kids 3-6 years old. I was asking this one 4-year-old what his dad does for a living because I see him wearing Muay Thai branding on his shirts. And I'm into contact sports too. I sometimes forget that kids don't pick up on conversation cues, nuances etc, so when I asked him what does your dad do, he comes back at me with dad isn't being very nice to mom so I'm moving to Florida. Yikes. Not a teacher, but when I was in high school I was sitting in the break room with my best friend talking about not having gotten laid and needing some really good sex. The door was open and our maths teacher just came in to ask something. When I said it, he just looked at me with very big eyes and left without saying anything. I think he never thought of me the same afterwards. I mean, not for no reason I would say. Most kids in high school are having their first serious relationships and losing their virginity and you're sitting there talking about it's been too long since you've got a good donging. Lmao. The only way I can imagine a high school kid talking this way unironically is if they were months away from graduation or less. Otherwise it'd be kind of trashy. He probably mostly walked away from an uncomfortable situation though. I am a student. One day at school was very hard. Chemistry, math, history of Europe, and biology, other minors ones as well. And this girl, which is very rude, said to herself quiet that this teacher can go to hell cause she gets too tired of this much learning. Chemistry teacher heard. Now is quiet. The teacher resumes the lesson. At the end of the day she got in the principal office. And from then on the teachers put a bad eye on her. Only going downhill from there. If a witch said that to me, I'd do the same. Subscribe to Real Time Reddit.